All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a busy Tuesday. As some of you know, or as you just heard, I was a postdoc here way back when, and I've been to Princeton since then, but I haven't been in this room. So it's really nice to be back, see lots of new faces. I feel like it's a totally different department than when I was here. So it's great. So this is a paper that is joint, as you can see, with Chris Weimer, who's at the Columbia Poverty Center, as well as Chloe Zilka, who was actually a fantastic undergrad at Brown, who has now gone on to work at Brookings. And she will probably be applying to PhD programs. So keep your eye out for her probably next year. She'll be a fantastic candidate. And as you can see from the title, this is a paper that will be looking at state level safety nets for kids in particular, and trying to understand essentially a very straightforward question of how the safety net kind of manifests at the household level with respect to both the amount of resources that people have from transfer income, as well as the kind of sources and multidimensionality of transfer income. Okay, so just by way of really kind of broad motivation before I dive into some hopefully kind of interesting illustrative figures, I think we all know that in the last several years, the role of the welfare state in the lives of families in the US has been maybe more a part of the public conversation than it typically is because of the context of the pandemic. But certainly to social scientists, the idea and the recognition that families and governments are the two primary sources of investment in kids is not new, right? And we have many decades of scholarship kind of teaching us a lot about that. What I've been interested in over the last several years is essentially the idea that, we have this really voluminous, high quality body of research linking the safety net and kind of public policies and programs to child well-being. And a lot of that kind of implicitly, at least, gets interpreted as kind of direct effects, right? And what we talk about less is how we think the safety net affects kids. And so what I've been interested in trying to understand through a series of kind of separate papers so far is the idea that some of what we have kind of thought about as the direct effect of the safety net on children is operating through family level processes that, at least in a relative sense, are kind of understudied, right? And as I was saying to people at dinner last night, in some ways I've been going about this in kind of a backwards way, and that I started by looking at the effects of the safety net on parental expenditures on their kids. I've looked at maternal time use with children, and kind of underlying all of that work has been a kind of discussion about a possible mechanism, which is the way that we think the safety net affects families and improves their capacity is essentially by giving them more resources, right? It's a resource pathway. And as I kind of dug into the literature, I realized that we actually know, in a relative sense, less about this kind of underlying resource pathway that we think is a really fundamental part of how we think governments affect families and affect kids. And so that's kind of where this particular paper comes into the literature, is in a really straightforward kind of way, as I summarize here at the bottom, using really striking variation in the size of safety nets across states in the US to really kind of describe at the most basic level how really widely variable levels and types of state investments in kids manifest at the household level in terms of money, right? Both the amount of money as well as the sources of that money. So a very descriptive question that I think is understudied in a relative sense. Okay. By the way, I should say, I know maybe it's not the norm in the seminar, but you're welcome to ask me questions throughout. I was saying to Todd, I'm teaching a big undergrad stats course this semester, and I'm really used to endlessly droning on to large bodies of undergrads. And so I'm always happy to have a chance to stop talking and answer questions. Okay, so to back up a little bit and kind of take a wider lens, these are two illustrative figures that will be familiar to many of you, maybe less familiar to some of you. These are taken, data just taken from the OECD website. And the 2 points to emphasize here are, first of all, that relative to our kind of peer countries, the safety net for children in the United States is small, right? This is not necessarily the case, as Matt Desmond and others have argued in their work, for spending and the safety net in other populations. But for children, the safety net in the United States is small. We have a smaller infrastructure of support in the area of income support, child care support, et cetera. And so the left graph here shows the United States in the red line at the bottom relative to the OECD average, which is the black line. And we can see, right, that levels of the safety net investments in kids are smaller in the US and have been, kind of pretty flat, right, over time. The second point to emphasize by way of kind of introduction is the child poverty rate, which is shown on the right graph here, again, from the OECD website. The red is the United States, right? And we can see that alongside this relatively small safety net for kids, we have very high levels of child poverty. Okay, so this is probably not surprising data, right, to most of you in this room. And so the logical kind of implication then for the purposes of this paper would be to say, okay, well, of course, the reason that the United States has high levels of child poverty and economic precarity more generally is because of the lower safety net, right? And so, of course, that's consistent with what I think the findings of this paper will show. But I think it's worth kind of taking a few minutes to emphasize that this is not necessarily a foregone conclusion, right? This idea that there should be a strong link between public investments, safety net investments, and households' economic well-being is a matter of fairly large debate, right, in both the public and kind of scholarly literatures. I was saying to a few people, this paper is an R&R right now going through the review process, and one of the reviewers on the paper, who might be in this room, who knows, very logically kind of raised the question of, this is fine, but why is it at all surprising, right, to think that safety net investment should increase household resources? That's exactly what the safety net is designed to do. And that's a very logical point to raise, but I think ignores what is a fairly longstanding and contemporaneous debate about whether, in fact, that should be the case, right? And so certainly in the public sphere, this is a source of constant debate, right? Kind of versions of the question that I put here, are safety net investments or kind of public investments more broadly a worthy use of government resources, is a question that in different forms is at the heart of all of the constant debates about whether there will be a government shutdown, right? And so we see this kind of in lots of different ways permeating the public sphere, but also in the scholarly literature, kind of starting with the very large comparative welfare states literature. That literature has for decades debated the importance of, on the one hand, welfare state investments, and on the other hand, other types of macroeconomic either investments or forces like economic growth, job supply, and the relative importance, right, of those different forces for shaping poverty and economic well-being. So that has been a longstanding debate in both the economics and the sociological literature cross-nationally. And I think that these debates also continue to permeate the US literature. And I could go on for hours about all of the different strands of this research, but I'll just highlight a few of the kind of key themes that raise the question, right, about why or how we should expect the safety net to be linked to household and child well-being. The first idea that could challenge this kind of, seemingly simple link between safety nets and economic resources is that it is theoretically possible, and many studies have examined this empirically, that safety net spending may actually increase poverty or in turn reduce economic resources if higher levels of generosity encourage dependency on the safety net and decrease employment, right, thereby kind of making people's overall income lower, right, than it might have been if they had not participated in the safety net. So this has been a bigger stream in perhaps economics, but also in sociology, right? This is a subject that's debated, and this is just one illustrative site from ASR in recent years. So that's one strand of research that's relevant for thinking about this question theoretically. Another strand of research that is really interesting is the idea that because families experience income volatility or income shocks, there is a phenomenon whereby even very slight increases in income due to whatever number of shocks, right, may lead families to lose eligibility for important safety net programs, leading to what is often referred to as benefits cliffs, right, that may again suppress the overall income that people have from a combination of different sources. Okay. There's a growing and really exciting body of research that many of you are probably familiar with on the kind of broad topic of administrative burdens, right, which has made some really interesting theoretical and empirical contributions to our understanding of the reasons why people don't use the safety net, right, even though they are eligible for a lot of different programs. And so that literature has taught us a lot about the challenges that are involved in even knowing about the existence of a transfer program, knowing about your own eligibility for that program, and then having established that you're eligible, figuring out how to enroll in that program, right? Whether it's needing to do an in-person interview or getting recertified every few months, all of these kind of what is referred to as administrative burdens, right, may cumulatively lead to a kind of high prevalence of safety net non-use, right, which could in turn make the observed effects of those programs smaller than we might expect, right? So that's certainly a relevant literature for thinking through this question conceptually. We also know that particularly for kids, the welfare state in the United States has contracted in kind of selective ways, particularly for the poorest families, right? And for families who have no earnings. And so one way of showing this just in a nice, simple way is shown in these two graphs here, where on the left, we have a graph just taken from a paper by Hoynes and Schanzenbach that looks at patterns over time in just the use of the safety net among different types of households with children, particularly contrasting households without earnings in the orange and households with earnings in the blue. And so we can see, coinciding, not entirely, right, but certainly along the period of welfare reform, that there's been really striking changes, right, in the use of the safety net, perhaps partly because of changes in eligibility, among other factors, in different types of households with families or with children. And on the right, we can see, this is a graph taken from a recent paper of mine with a grad student that shows changes over time from about 1980 to 2020 in the use of the safety net. This is the percentage change in the number of safety net benefits that households with kids are receiving. And we see this by race. And so we can see that over this period, white households with children, which is in the top left here, have dramatically increased their engagement with the safety net, while we see much more stable and kind of flat patterns among Black and other race households with kids, right? So all of this is just to kind of illustrate that idea of welfare state contraction for selective types of families with children that again may complicate, right, the seemingly simple relationship between safety net generosity and what that looks like at the household level. And then the last point that's relevant here, and I was fortunately got to have dinner last night with Matt Desmond, and I wasn't sure how much time to devote to his recent book in this talk, but we see this argument kind of manifested really recently in Matt's book, which among other things kind of offers a version of the argument that the US spends a lot on its safety net, at least for certain populations relative to some other countries. And as he argues, there aren't as many benefits to poverty reduction, right? So all of these are kind of strands of the literature, different literatures in a lot of ways that are out there that kind of come together, right, to have relevance for how we think about this big picture relationship between the safety net and economic well-being. Okay, so despite these kind of many different strands of research, which perhaps offer countervailing ideas, right, about what we should expect, at the national level, I think and at the comparative level, I think it's fair to say that we have very compelling evidence that the safety net works, right, for increasing economic resources and for reducing poverty. So we know, just to zoom in on the case of the United States, that welfare spending does reduce poverty, and more broadly, that a strong welfare state benefits families and children through reductions in not only overall poverty, but also declines in deep poverty, extreme poverty. And that this happens because of the ways in which different types of safety net investments, direct cash, but also in-kind benefits, allow families, parents to do different things, right, with their money than they would otherwise be able to do. Okay, so again, to illustrate this really simply at the national level, we can see very clearly how the supplemental poverty rate, which is the blue line here, has decreased quite dramatically over time, particularly during the pandemic period, which is the very tail end of that graph, in large part because of these temporary influxes of transfers, right, through the federal government. Similarly, we know that just as spending expansions decrease poverty at the national level, retrenchments in spending, right, have kind of countervailing effects. And we don't know a ton about this yet, but we can see that illustrated really clearly here with the retrenchment, right, of some of the pandemic era investments, again, at the national level. So all of this is to say, in a fairly quick way, the federal and kind of national story about the role of the safety net in reducing poverty and improving economic well-being, I think, is pretty clear. Where I think we know much less in a relative sense, it's not that we know nothing, is at the subnational level, right? And particularly at the state level for the case of the United States. And so that's kind of where we're coming in here. And why is that important? For lots of reasons, right? But one of the reasons that that is really important is because there's a lot of state variation in not just levels of poverty, right? So as I summarize here, child poverty is typically around 20% in a state like California and around 10% in a state like Iowa. But importantly, states also vary quite dramatically in the size of their investments in children, and correspondingly the decisions, right, that they make about the size of the safety net. So these are data just from a snapshot. This is 1 year from 2016, taken from the state-by-state spending on kids data set, which is some of the data I'll be using today. And it allows us to see things like the fact that the highest spending states, which are typically places like Vermont, spend over 3 times per child on a kind of bundle of child-focused programs than the lowest spending states, which tend to be places like Utah and Idaho. So it's both the levels of the safety net for kids that vary a lot across states, and we also don't necessarily always see really high correlations across different types of spending programs, right? And so that raises interesting questions about whether states are kind of universally investing in a generous safety net, or if they're selectively investing, right, in particular types of programs. So correlations across different types of spending typically range from around 0.1 to 0.4. Another way of showing the variation that exists across states is to look at not just levels of spending, which is what that last bar graph showed across states, but also the amount of change that exists within states, right, in safety net investments. And so this graph is just a simple, quick way, efficient way of showing the amount of change during our study period, 1998 to 2016, in the total amount of spending per child across this bundle of programs that I'll talk more about. And we can see that while all states have increased their safety nets over time, there's a lot of variation in the size of those increases, with states like Vermont and other states in the Northeast increasing their spending by over 100%, right, in contrast to other states scattered throughout the West and the South. So it's both the levels of the safety net, again, as well as the amount of change in the generosity of those nets over time. Okay, so all of this to kind of summarize, right, we're kind of motivated by the idea that states have a lot of control over the size and generosity of their public support for kids. That's important for lots of reasons, one of which is that policymakers are continuing to debate how or whether to support families via public investments, right? And we know a lot at the national level about the anti-poverty effects of public investments, but we don't know as much at the state level, right, about this kind of resource pathway that we think theoretically should be a really important link, right, between government and children. Okay, so that's the overall motivation. To reiterate our specific questions before I jump into the data, what we're going to be asking here in this paper is first, as I said, how do these widely variable state safety nets manifest at the household level? We're looking at the amount of income and the sources of transfer income, and what types of public investments are particularly important for contributing to the total resources that families with children have. So this is a way of getting at that question of whether we should think about state level safety nets as kind of universal or selective, right? Okay. In terms of what we should expect, this is just a really simple kind of brief articulation of what we would expect. Based on prior work, we would think that state safety net investments should certainly increase the amount of household income, and that this should be disproportionately the case for households at the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution because of the means-tested nature of many public supports. And we would also expect that state investment should lead to a greater mix or multidimensionality of transfer income sources among households with kids, again, particularly those at the bottom of the education and income distribution. Okay, so what we're going to do to look at these questions very descriptively is to link together a couple sources of data. The first of which is the state-by-state spending on kids data set, which is a state year database that I've been collecting in collaboration with colleagues at the Urban Institute over the last several years. We probably should have given it a catchier name, but it's a very literal name and it does what it says it intends to do. So this is a state year database of public spending in states from state level, but also from federal and local sources. The data that are public right now are for 1997 to 2016, and this is for all 50 states and DC. We've just finished extending the data to 2021, and we'll soon be able in the next few months to bring in 2022 data. And so I'm not using those data here, but this is kind of the pre-pandemic time series. And so these data allow us, importantly, to measure per child spending. Here we're looking at spending in 2016 dollars at the state year level on a variety of major programs in different buckets. So income support, health, education, and housing and community development. So we start by measuring total spending across these different programs, and that includes all of the programs I've listed here. And then in some analyses, we will pull out certain domains of state investments, particularly spending on cash programs, tax credits, and nutrition, as a way of trying to get kind of more directly at what we think best measures that resource pathway that we have in mind, right? So certainly public investments in education are, if you believe models of human capital development, right, very important in the indirect, kind of in their indirect effects on long-term opportunities, right, for families and children. But those types of investments are less likely to kind of immediately manifest at the household level, right, in terms of the sources of transfer income. So we include those measures in our overall spending measure, and then we pull out these kind of more targeted types of investments as well. Okay. This is just a list of all of the programs that are included in the state spending data. And so I'm happy to talk more about this if people have questions. Importantly, less relevant for this paper, but for what we're trying to do with a lot of these programs that are huge and serve many different populations, like Medicaid or SNAP, is pull out the child portion, right, of those investments, because Medicaid is a huge program, right? What we want to know is how much of that money is going to children, which is difficult to do, actually. This is where my urban colleagues have been so useful. Okay, so we're linking the state spending data to data on household economic well-being, and we're using the kind of augmented CPS ASIC data set that has been produced by people at Columbia in the Poverty Center. Their data goes back to 1967 and really provides an excellent source of measurement of household income in a way that also includes transfer income, which is not something we get, right, with the income measures that go into the official poverty measure. We're going to be using that data set from 1998, right, to match the period that we have for the state spending measure, and focusing on a couple of different household income measures. The first is two different measures of total income, one of which is pre-tax, pre-transfer, right? So this is kind of a standard market income measure. The second is a total income measure that is post-tax, post-transfer. So as I say in the parentheses, this includes all income sources, net of taxes, plus the value of cash and non-cash government transfers. And then we pull out selectively certain kind of buckets of income to try to match to some of our state spending measures. So we look separately at food and nutrition, transfer income, housing, cash transfers, and tax-based transfers. Okay. It's important to acknowledge that our measures of household income don't always perfectly match the inputs to our state spending measures. So for example, food and nutrition income, we include SNAP, WIC, and school lunch, whereas our state spending measure of nutrition only includes SNAP, for example. So we've done a lot of sensitivity analyses to limit our income measures to the same programs, and we see really similar patterns. So we've taken the more umbrella measures here. We also have a bunch of controls. Happy to talk more about these at both the household and the state level. A lot of what we're doing is very descriptive and what doesn't even use these controls, but in some of our analyses, we do incorporate them. And these come from both the CPS as well as a variety of state databases to measure demographic composition, how other features of the policy context at the state year level, things like the unionization rate at the state level, et cetera. Okay, so I've told you our approach is really descriptive. It's important to emphasize that. And so a lot of what I'm going to show you falls into this first kind of item here, which is taking each of these measures of income and resources, looking at these income measures across the distribution of state spending, and considering these patterns separately according to both the education of the household reference person as well as quartiles of income, right? So what does transfer income look like across state spending for different types of households, right? That's kind of the primary question that we're engaged in. And then the second question is to acknowledge, right, that there's lots of things that differ across states and time. And although we're kind of pretty limited in how far we can push the causal inference kind of question here, we want to do as much as we can to account for differences across and within states, and to kind of pull out some of what is clearly economic need from also state policy choices. And so we're going to use a two-way fixed effects approach to predict these different household income components from state year spending in models with state and year fixed effects. Okay, and we do this stratified by the education of the household reference person, again, relying on that really large amount of spending variation that exists within and across states. If there's time at the end, I can briefly talk about a bunch of additional analyses we've done, including a difference in differences analysis that uses state spending as a continuous treatment intensity kind of measure, although there's lots of caveats to that because I don't think that we can argue that this is an exogenous mechanism. Okay, so overall, we think that our measure allows us to engage with this question at the bottom: how are state investments related to different parts of the distribution by SES via potentially different programs across different state spending environments? Okay, so to jump into some of the findings, what we started by doing is really trying to confirm prior work at the national level, right? So there's a lot going on with these bar graphs, even though they're very descriptive. So just to kind of give you a roadmap here, I'm showing on the left the mean amount of income across percentiles of the distribution. On the left here, I'm showing mean income from pre-transfer in the dark gray and post-transfer income across different quartiles of SES, of income rather. And on the right, we're showing that same relationship, mean income pre-transfer in the dark gray, post-transfer in the light gray across different levels of education. Okay, so kind of trying to tap into these two different indicators of SES. Just to pull out a couple of key things to notice here. The first is, as I've summarized in the bullet point, among households in the bottom quartile of income, and the same applies to education, we see that the safety net is doing what we would expect it to do, right? Where we see that average post-transfer income is higher, right, among this segment of the distribution than it is the case for pre-transfer income, right? So it's, as I say here, in the case of income, it's about $6,000 higher for that bottom quartile, right? And we see something similar when we stratify by education. Okay, so that's the first thing to notice. In contrast, right, again, as we would expect, among the highest education or income and education groups, right, we see the opposite, where average post-transfer income is lower than pre-transfer resources, right? Again, consistent with what we know nationally and suggesting that taxes, right, are doing more to reduce transfer income than transfers are doing to pull it up, right, among the top of the distribution. And then the final point to emphasize here in this kind of confirmatory slide is that if we look at the kind of groups above the bottom of the distribution, right, but not at the top, we see that the safety net is doing less to increase the resources of those who are kind of just above the bottom, right, in the case of both income as well as education. Okay. And so overall, what this graph is showing, again, I think consistent with what we see nationally, is that the welfare state is kind of working to increase the total resources of people at the bottom of the distribution while doing less to increase the resources of those not just at the top, right, but also kind of just above the bottom of the distribution. Okay. When we look to see how that pattern varies across the distribution of state spending, these graphs show that in a kind of simple way by breaking state spending into terciles, right? And so we've got low, medium, and high levels of state spending. Again, we're showing here mean income received from both pre-transfer income as well as post-transfer in the light gray. And we're again showing this separately for here on the left, the bottom income quartile, right? So these graphs are zooming in on the bottom of the distribution, looking at the bottom income quartile on the left and the lowest educated households, those with less than a high school education on the right. And the thing to note in this graph is that, as I say in the bullet here, average post-transfer income is higher in the highest spending state years, right? So the difference between pre-transfer and post-transfer income is about over $7,000 in the highest spending state years, in contrast to about $4,800, right, in the lowest spending state years. So that's the pattern that we see in the bottom quartile. When we look at the lowest educated households, we see a similar pattern that's less pronounced, right, because there's more income heterogeneity in education groups. So this is kind of beginning to suggest that we see, right, across the distribution of state spending, a more pronounced role, right, of the safety net in raising the resources of the lowest resource households. Okay. The other thing to note here that's interesting is that if we look at the highest spending state years and just focus on pre-transfer income, we can see that in those state years, pre-transfer income is actually lower, right, in more generous states than it is in the lowest spending state years. So this is just pulling out one of those differences. And this is consistent with the idea that states are doing what we would expect them to do or hope that they would do, right, which is to respond to economic need. Okay, so this is consistent. And the opposite, of course, of what we see if we look at post-transfer income. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the question about levels of transfer income, right? Are they higher or lower for different types of households across different types of places? We also want to turn to the question of the sources of income. So how multidimensional is transfer income? Is it all coming from one source, right? Or is it much more kind of heterogeneous? So one way of looking at that question is shown here, where again, we're continuing this theme of looking at mean income, right, from transfer sources. We're focusing here on differences in the sources of income across the educational distribution. And what we can see kind of in a nutshell is that among the lowest educated households, the sources of transfer income are much more multidimensional, right? If we just focus on the less than high school group, we see a more multidimensional mix of transfer income than we see among those with higher levels of education, among whom transfer income is dominated by cash transfers, in particular unemployment and Social Security transfers, which comprise something like 60% of the transfers that higher educated households get from the government. So that's summarized here. And again, that's for the overall kind of population, but what we want to do is understand also whether that varies across the distribution of state spending. So there's lots of different ways that we could do this. One of the ways that we look at this is to look across percentiles of total state year spending. How much income, right? What's the average income that's being received from these different types of transfer buckets, right? So again, we're trying to kind of figure out ways to efficiently get at this question of, are states selectively investing, right? In which case we would expect to see this bar dominated, right, by one particular type of investment. And what we find when we look at average levels of income, right, is that there's actually a pretty kind of heterogeneous mix across the distribution of state spending. And so this is kind of inconsistent in some ways with the idea of a selective safety net, and was actually slightly surprising to us because when you look at the correlations across different types of spending, they're not very high, right, at the state level. But actually what we're finding is that income, as you increase across the distribution of state spending, right, tends to still be pretty heterogeneous with respect to its sources. Another way to look at this is to look at not levels of income, but the share of income received from each of these different types of sources, again, across the distribution of state spending. And we see something really similar when we do this, right, which is that the share of income from all of these different sources is fairly steady across the distribution. Okay, so collectively, we think these two different ways, which are just some of the ways that we could look at this question of selective versus universal investment, are more consistent with the idea that state safety nets are increasing transfer income pretty broadly, right, rather than doing so in selective areas. Okay. And then the final thing that I'll show you with respect to this multidimensionality question is to look at versions of what I've just shown you, right? So the amount of income that people are receiving from these different buckets. So this is mean income received from different transfer sources across terciles of state spending, low, medium, and high. And now what we want to understand is the question of whether that multidimensionality varies across the distribution, the educational distribution, right? So are lower educated households living in more generous safety nets, right, getting a more multidimensional mix of investments than their similarly educated peers, right, living in less generous safety nets? And the answer seems to be yes, right, that transfer income is not only higher from these different sources, but it's also more multidimensional in states that have more generous safety nets, right? Even if we just look at the lowest educated households. So just to give you a sense of the amount of income, right, that people are receiving across these different buckets, right? On average, people in the highest tercile spending state years, right, who are in lower educated households are receiving almost $1,000 a year in tax credit income, over $600 in cash transfers, similar for housing support and for food assistance. Okay, so those levels are both higher as well as more heterogeneous, again, in these more generous state safety nets. Yeah.
Just a clarifying question for the tax credit calculations. Does that include like private school tax credit? And that kind of, which are more common in the very, very low spending states.
Yeah, that's a good question. And no, it does not. If I just quickly go back to the programs that are included in, so tax transfers as we're measuring them here are just EITC and CTC. So at least at the household level, and then at the spending level, we've tried to match that pretty closely. Okay.
Question. So
Oh,
that
yes.
slide, is that a counterintuitive or surprising finding that states with more generous allocations would also allocate funds to various and multi-dimensional purposes?
It's a really good question, and I think I don't know that I'd say it's completely counterintuitive, but I don't think it's entirely expected, given what we see if we just look at, again, these correlations at the state level across these different buckets, right? So if I were to just correlate all different types of spending in New York State, right, the correlation might be like 0.3. And so it wouldn't immediately be clear to me what that means, right? If New York State, I mean, we know based on prior knowledge, right, that New York happens to have a generous safety net across a number of domains. But the question is across all of the different states, right? Does that mean that we're seeing selective or universal investment?
And not even a little bit, are there exceptions in which are there states where you have generous allocations and not just diversity?
There are some. I don't have a slide that pulls those out, although I should add one. But I guess an easy case to think about would be there are states that invest a lot in education, for example, but maybe have much less robust income support programs for families, or, for example, don't have, I mean, most states now have a state EITC, but there are still a few that don't. So there are examples like that.
But we don't know why.
I'm sure that there is a body of research of looking at why that is the case and some of the political dimensions of that, but yeah. But you're motivating me to add a nice slide about that.
And the
into the top.
education stuff, which is the other part, like court orders,
Mhm.
play a role in that.
Yes, right. So often it might not even be something that the state wanted to do, right? But they end up being forced to spend a lot in one area while de-emphasizing others. Yep. Okay, just being mindful of time, I will try to kind of quickly wrap up so we have some time for maybe more questions. The last part of what we do, and I'll just show you kind of some brief examples, happy to talk about these more, is to try to engage with this question as much as we can of, okay, these differences that you've shown are interesting. Are they really having anything to do with the choices that states are making about their safety nets, right? Or is it that the states that have a lot of economic need are spending more money, right? Because they have a lot of economic need and not because they're kind of trying to develop a strong infrastructure of support for their young populations. And so we try to kind of engage with this question again to the extent that we can with our data using the two-way fixed effects approach to try to pull out as many of the time varying state characteristics as we can about demographic composition, economic need, et cetera. And so just to kind of show you one representative finding from those analyses, these are predictions from the two-way fixed effects models where we look across the distribution of state spending. Here I'm showing you spending particularly on food support, food assistance, and I'm showing you standard deviations of spending. The y-axis is the amount of income, right, received from the corresponding transfer source. So this is income received from SNAP and WIC and school lunch supports. And the different lines here are different levels of the educational distribution. So the lines that we'll pay the most attention to are the red, which is the highest educated households, and the orangey yellow, which are the lowest educated households. And so what we want to pay attention to here is that at the higher, more generous state years, right, of states that spend more on nutrition assistance for their families, there's a larger gap, right, a larger difference between the amount of transfer income that the lowest educated households are receiving for nutrition assistance compared to the highest educated households. So in the most generous state years, this difference is about $1,500 compared to only about $100 in the least generous state safety nets, right? And as we can see, it's not that in the more generous state years, the higher educated households are getting a lot more money, right, from the safety net, but rather it's about the amount of money that the lowest educated households are receiving. Okay. Another way of thinking about this, right, this is standard deviations. I've summarized here in dollar amounts, right? So about $1,000 increase in SNAP spending at the state year level is associated with an increase of about $2,500 a year in corresponding transfer income from food and nutrition for the lowest educated households. This just shows you, I won't talk about these in detail, the kind of corresponding analyses for other types of state investments. So nutrition is what I just showed you. We also look at patterns for tax credits as well as for cash transfers. The results are broadly similar. The one thing to note is that for cash transfers, we don't see the same kind of dominant benefit of state spending for the lowest educated households, right? So that orange line there is the lower educated households, and we don't see the same pattern for cash that we see for tax credits and for nutrition, right? So this is consistent with the literature showing that the kind of cash transfer safety net has become less dominant, right, for the lowest resource households in the United States in recent years. Okay, I will kind of skip over these additional analyses just for the purposes of time, although I'm happy to talk more about them. We've done lots of things as much as we can with our data to try to kind of probe how consistent these patterns are. Again, happy to come back to any of these, but just to kind of sum up for the purposes of time, what we're trying to do here, again, as I said at the beginning, is really to build on a largely cross-national and national evidence base to think about how what is an increasingly relevant unit, right, for households, the state safety net, manifests, right, with respect to the components of transfer income, and to really provide a detailed description about the sources and types of income. There's lots of limitations. I'm also happy to talk more about those. But I would just kind of emphasize to sum up that I think what we find is that even in this era of kind of selective welfare state contraction for the lowest resource households with kids, we're finding really, I think, consistent evidence that state supports are raising, right, the total resources and incomes of the households that are most in need, and that their income is coming from a greater diversity of sources, right, as we would kind of hope from a developmental perspective. Okay. I also mentioned briefly that we find that the benefits of cash investments, while they are positive, are less pronounced among the lowest resource households, again, consistent, I think, with growing evidence in that domain. And again, the patterns that we see are consistent with the idea that there is a strong relationship between state investments and this underlying resource pathway that is often kind of theoretically implied, right, in our models of how we think the welfare state affects kids. And then the last thing that I just think is useful to end on, which maybe I should begin with, is that it's interesting to think about these findings in relation to patterns of different types of investment in the United States over time. And as we can see from this nice graph from the Urban Institute, spending on kids, which are the blue kind of shares here, has really remained pretty flat, right, over time. This is from 1960 until projected through 2029. Compared to particularly, right, spending on adult populations, particularly on entitlement programs, right? And these increases in spending are not surprising as the population has aged, but it's interesting and disheartening, right, to think about these flat patterns at the bottom in light of, I think, the growing body of evidence that we have that it's exactly those types of safety net investments that seem to be a really promising way of reducing gaps by education and income. So that's my slightly disheartening end, and I'll stop there just so we have time for questions. Thank you.